Hi, welcome again back to another episode of Basement Bible Breakdown. We're in part three, maybe part two of part three, and we're talking about the second coming. We've talked about in the Olivet. In our last video, we talked about how the word parousia is being used in an Old Testament sense of coming on clouds as judgment. The Son of Man, of course, refers to Jesus himself as his own nickname, and that it comes from Daniel 7:13 and 14. And it's not talking about Jesus coming down, it is talking about Jesus ascending to the right hand, and from there he sends judgment in his vindication. Now, with that being said, we also talked about a little bit about Parousia and parousia. Now, I want to get a little bit more into the specifics of Matthew 23 and point out a few different things here and about that whole passage. And some of the things that are being talked about, what happens when he comes. That did not happen in 70 AD. And these are very clear things. The first thing that people bring up is they talk about he comes with signs. And so the signs, of course, is the earthquakes and the moon, the stars, and all of those things where governments are being toppled and all this imagery that is being produced. And then it says he will come like a thief. Well, if you're going to give signs and come like a thief, what is the point of like a thief? And we know he talks about that in Thessalonians, and he uses kind of the same imagery that I argued that Matthew being written after 2 Thessalonians. Maybe I didn't bring that up. Maybe I forgot to bring that up in the last video. But the point is that Matthew, the book of Matthew, was written after Thessalonians. Matthew was a companion to Paul for a while. In fact, when Paul talks about on the night that he was betrayed, in 1 Corinthians 11, he is reciting something he didn't see himself, but he's reciting something that he had heard from the oral traditions of the apostles themselves. And this would have been, of course, from Matthew. Luke was not there, of course. He wrote a gospel, but it was all based on what other people said. He was never an eyewitness. And Luke, for the eye-owers, was Greek. He was a Greek doctor who became converted and saved and traveled with Paul for some time and is talked about in the book of Acts of being with Paul. So he's writing the Acts narrative. He learned about, Paul learned about everything concerning that night from Matthew. And Matthew was written after 2 Thessalonians. I hate to say it, but that's absolutely true. And that's what the scholars will sit there and argue with about. And if I've got one or two scholars, preterists, to say that's not true, I'm sorry. I'm not going to believe what one or two people like Don Preston or Ed or anybody else says when they have no historical backing to back that up. It just, I can't do it. Sorry. I don't believe, man. Two people over a whole lot of men who no Greek, no Hebrew, who studied all the early church writings. And the first thing that any one of those guys will do is tell you that they don't study the early Christian fathers. Most of you preterists will sit there and tell them you don't study the early Christian fathers because they're not inspired, so why bother to read them? And at least Ed has enough sense to read them and understand them. And I think Don has read some of them too, even though he denies everything about it. So it talks about him becoming like a thief. Okay. What thief ever comes with signs and points up signs or writes out signs and say, hey, I'm going to be coming. I'm going to come on March 25th. I'm robbing your house. And here's the signs that I'm coming. I'm going to do this. This is going to happen. This is going to happen. This thing. And that way, if you see those things happen, no, I'm going to rob your house that night. It doesn't happen. So what is he talking about, Matthew, about like a thief? What he's talking about is how that they happens. A thief comes, steals and everything else, and you don't know that he's coming till what? After the fact. So the whole point of that is it's something that happens very quickly, unknown, you weren't ready for it, you didn't see it, you didn't know it was going to happen, but all of a sudden he comes like a thief, he takes what he's going to get and he gets out of there. You go back and go, what happened? I just got robbed? So the signs are not about his coming. The signs are about what? Him coming to take people away in judgment. That is 25 in there. When we're talking about separating the goats and the sheep, were the Christians all fled? Yes, there's your separation going on. He gathered all the saints where? In Pella. He didn't gather them in some other place or into heaven or anything else. He gathered them out of the city and kept them safe. So there's your dividing. There's your judgment that came upon them was, hey, you guys are sticking around. You're the one going to be judged. You guys, you get out of there, out of the way. There's your warnings to those people to flee, to get out of there. But for the others that are left before, it's coming down suddenly, quickly. They're not going to have a clue it's going to happen. The next thing they know, it's all coming down upon them. And I think that makes a whole lot more sense than the other stuff. Now, what else happens with his coming? Now, please ask questions about this. Free field to comment, and I will do my best to answer to make it more clear. Here, I'm just trying not to be too long-winded and to put too much into it so we get lost in everything. Like I think I did with not mentioning Matthew was written after 2 Thessalonians. That's just a historical fact. So there's nothing about what Paul wrote that was matching or using Matthew as a background, his book. That's just simply silly. So here's the other thing. When he comes, it says he comes to kill the beast and the false prophet in Revelations. Okay, it doesn't matter who you call the beast is. It has to be some kind of Roman leader. Even if you can't call it a zealot leader, that would be impossible to do. I'll explain that in a minute. But if there was a beast who was a Roman ruler that was killed, when we look at the historical evidence, there was none. Tacitus, who did the destruction, whoever was charged, not Vespasian. Vespasian, was it? None of those, nobody died. Nobody died. No Roman ruler died in 70 AD. I'm letting the dog out here. None. So there's nobody who was killed. Preterists can't tell you who the false prophet was. All they have is conjecture and everything else. Now, some of them, like Adam, is trying to argue that the beast was actually a Roman zealot. Now, think about this. The beast gathers an army. It is his army that surrounds Jerusalem. Please explain to me how the Roman zealots who are living inside of Jerusalem in 66 AD gathered an army and laid siege to Jerusalem. Didn't happen, folks. It was a Roman army that laid siege. Therefore, the Roman army would have to be led by the beast. And if the beast was going to be thrown alive, then he had to be living. There was nobody that died, none of that. And if people can't understand that none of that scenario fits 70 AD, no matter how you try to cram it in, no matter how you try to make it work, it will not work. It does not work. It will not do. No beast was thrown alive or died. There's no false prophet that was ever identified. You can't have the beast gathering an army against Jerusalem itself. And the whole idea that if God sent the Roman army there, when Jesus returned with his army, then it was to destroy the army that God sent. See, there's another inconsistency that is not coherent. God will not send judgment and then send his own army to fight the army he sent. His goal was to destroy Jerusalem, not to defend it. When we look at Zechariah 14, all the way through, that could be another video, of course. When you examine those things, they're literally, the inhabitants of Jerusalem were to be protected on that day. That's what it says. We can read it, and obviously I'll do another video on that one. Obviously, I'm going to have to do it. Maybe that will be the next one. I'll pull up the scripture and do it. So right now, what I also want to get across for you, he comes with the saints. That's the other thing I talked about briefly in the first video. He comes with the saints. Zechariah 14:4. And in 2 Thessalonians 3, he comes with the saints. Revelation 19, he comes with his saints. They come with him. Why are they coming with him? They are his army. That's what it described. Is this literally or spiritually? And I say literally, based on Revelations 20, which we'll get into a little bit further. So right now, I just want to clarify, when he comes with the saints. And that is the army. That is what is described in Revelation 19, and it is literal. But that will be, of course, another point, and I'll make sure I make notes to make a video, and we'll talk about it some more. The other thing that happens is when he comes to rule over the nations with his saints. Now, this is proven because it says he will rule the nations with a rod of iron. The concept of a rod of iron is a tool that is used, a symbol of authority, primarily. But it is used as a thing to threaten with. It is used something to inflict. It is power and authority that is absolute. You will do it, and here comes the rod if you don't. In other words, justice will come on you swift and clearly. And we can't say that any way, sense, or form that Christ was ruling over the nations in a literal fashion when he comes. And so obviously that will be another point that we want to bring up, and we can talk about more. The other thing that's going to happen, the millennial kingdom begins with Christ ruling over his restored Israel, and he is dwelling in the city that he loves. Revelations 20, the camp of the saints. That word camp there is battlements or barracks. This army that comes with him is going to be with him there in Jerusalem. And in Zechariah it says, year after year, the survivors of those other nations will come to Jerusalem year after year and celebrate the Feast of Booths, which means they will fellowship with him. God is inviting them, the people, to come to get to know him, to get to meet with him, get to see him. I mean, he's ruling of the world, most powerful guy, of course, obviously, and they're coming to dwell in fellowship with him. That is his invitation to the world, for them to get to know him. He is not going to be secluded behind closed doors and you never get to see him like some Wizard of Oz character or something like that. But the idea that he's dwelling in the city that he loves. Now, isn't it interesting? Revelations 20 calls Jerusalem the city he loves. I thought he divorced it. And of course, we'll get into a video about why 20 is not a recap, if I haven't done so already. So at this point, I'm going to leave it right there. And I'm looking at my notes. And we'll come back on those other points. And we will deal with them more specifically in a future video. So right now, thank you. Thank you for sticking around and listening. Maybe 3 or 4 minutes, and then you're maybe used to, but thank you for hanging around, and we'll catch you on the flip side.